Okay, so today we're really diving into something that's, I think, on everyone's minds these days.
Mm.
How do online businesses actually keep our payment card data safe?
Yeah, it's something we all kind of take for granted, right? We just plug in our card info and hope for the best.
Right. But you, our listeners, have pointed us to some really fascinating material on this. We've got insights from testing experts they deal with, like the whole cybersecurity testing landscape.
Uh-huh.
We've got the PCI DSS e-commerce guidelines straight from the PCI Security Standards Council. That's from 2013. But it still really lays the groundwork for how things are done.
Definitely. A lot of the core principles still hold up.
And then we've got an annual report from PS Web, a company that's right in the thick of e-commerce operations.
Yeah, they handle a lot of the behind-the-scenes stuff for other businesses, so they've got that real-world view.
Exactly. So our goal today is to break this all down. How do we actually secure online transactions? And what is this payment card industry data security standard, or PCI DSS, all about?
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack, but it's super important to understand, especially if you're running an online business or even thinking about starting one.
So the testing experts material, that gives us a peek into what kind of security checks online retailers are, or at least should be, doing.
Absolutely. And the PCI DSS guidelines, like you said, they might not be brand new, but they really do set out those fundamental security rules that every online business needs to follow.
Okay, and the PS Web report, that kind of gives us a boots-on-the-ground look at how a company that's handling e-commerce for other brands deals with all these security demands.
Day in and day out.
Every single day. So at the heart of it all seems to be this thing called PCI DSS. If a business is taking card payments online, they can't really ignore it, can they?
No, not really. I mean, the guidelines are super clear about this. They state outright, like, if you're using any kind of e-commerce technology to accept payment cards online, well, guess what? Those technologies, they're covered by the PCI DSS requirements.
It's not a choice. It's a must.
It's baked right in.
Okay, so that's pretty clear-cut. You're processing payments online. You're in PCI DSS territory. But what if a business says, hey, you know what? I'm going to outsource my whole online store. I'm going to have someone else run the website, the payments, everything.
Yeah.
Can they just pass the security buck, so to speak?
You know, that's a great question, and it's something a lot of businesses probably wonder about. But the guidelines are, they're pretty firm on this one, too.
Okay.
Even if a merchant, contracts with another company to basically run their whole online store for them, the ultimate responsibility for making sure those PCI DSS requirements are met still lies with the original merchant.
So you can't just outsource the obligation to be secure.
Nope, you can't.
That's a really crucial takeaway for anyone running an online business or even thinking of starting one.
For sure.
So these PCI DSS guidelines, who exactly are they aimed at? Is it just the online stores themselves?
No, actually, it's a little broader than that. The guidelines explicitly talk about a few different groups. First, obviously, you've got the merchants themselves, anyone who's using or planning to use e-commerce technology.
Makes sense.
But it also includes those third-party service providers.
Right, the companies that provide the platforms, the tools, even the hosting services.
Exactly. And then it's also a resource for the people who assess these e-commerce environments. They come in and check if everything's compliant with PCI DSS.
Okay, makes sense. So we've talked about PCI DSS, the big picture. Now, when you think about making an online purchase, there are a lot of different pieces involved, right? You've got your shopping cart, the payment page, things happening behind the scenes. What are the key components that PCI DSS really zeroes in on?
Well, there are several that are explicitly called out. I mean, let's start with something everyone's familiar with, right? The shopping cart software.
Yep, that's where we put all our goodies before we check out.
Exactly. And the guidelines are very specific. These e-commerce payment applications, your shopping cart software, they should be validated against something called the Payment Application Data Security Standard. We usually just call it PADSS.
PADSS. Okay, what's that all about?
Think of it like a specific set of security rules just for payment software. So it makes sure that the software itself is built with security in mind from the very beginning.
Okay, so it's like a security seal of approval.
Yeah, kinda. And the PCI Security Standards Council, they actually keep a list of validated PADSS applications.
Oh, that's handy. So businesses can know they're choosing a tool that's been vetted?
Exactly. And for businesses that develop their own custom shopping cart software, they strongly recommend using PADSS as a best practice.
Smart. Secure from the ground up.
Yeah.
Now, what about the moment we actually hit that Pay Now button? How does our data travel across the internet? That always makes me a little nervous.
Yeah, that's where encryption comes in. The guidelines are really big on SSL and TLS.
Ah, those acronyms.
Right. Secure sockets layer and transport layer security. It's basically like scrambling the data you enter, your credit card number, so that anyone snooping around can't read it.
Oh, like a secret code.
Pretty much. That little padlock icon you see in your browser when you're checking out, that usually means you've got an active TLS connection.
So that's what that means. I always wondered. Okay, so secure shopping cart software and this encrypted connection. What other parts of an e-commerce setup have to be PCI DSS compliant?
Well, we also have to think about all the infrastructure that supports everything. That includes your network components, like your routers and firewalls, anything involved in transmitting or processing the cardholder data.
The behind-the-scenes stuff.
Exactly. And then you've got the web servers themselves. These are often the first point of contact. They might be receiving the payment card data or sending it onto other systems. So they definitely fall under PCI DSS.
Do they have to be secure too?
Absolutely. And there's a really important rule here. The guidelines explicitly state that primary account numbers, so that's your full credit card number, and any sensitive authentication data, like your CVV code, they can never be stored on web servers.
Never. That's pretty strict.
Yep, that's a hard line.
So where's that information stored then? What about the servers that actually process everything and hold the databases?
Right, so you've got your application servers. They handle a lot of the heavy lifting, the processing and transmitting of the cardholder data. They're definitely in scope. And then, of course, you have your data storage, which includes database servers.
Right, the big vault of information.
Exactly. And those database servers, they should never be publicly accessible. PCI DSS requirement 1.3.7 is very clear about that. In a typical setup, the database should only accept requests from authenticated application servers, not directly from the outside world.
Got it. So it's not just the obvious payment page. It's the whole technical ecosystem that has to be buttoned up.
At every piece of the puzzle.
Now, we've been talking about e-commerce in a general sense, but businesses set up their online stores in different ways, right? Some manage everything themselves, some outsource bits and pieces. How do PCI DSS responsibilities change based on these different models?
That's where it gets really interesting. The guidelines actually lay out several common ways e-commerce is implemented.
Okay.
So first, you've got what we call merchant-managed e-commerce. This is where the business handles pretty much everything themselves, the website, the payment processing, the whole shebang.
Okay, so they're in control.
They are, and that means they've got significant PCI DSS responsibilities across all those components we just talked about.
Makes sense. If you control it, you're responsible for securing it.
Exactly.
What if they decide to use a pre-built commercial shopping cart or a payment application, something off the shelf?
Even then, they've still got PCI DSS responsibilities.
Really?
Yep. They need to make sure the application itself has been validated against PA DSS, like we talked about, and they're still responsible for securing the environment where it runs.
So the server, the network, all that.
All of that.
Okay, so using third-party software doesn't get you off the hook completely. What about those setups where it looks like you're paying on the retailer's site, but the data actually goes straight to a payment processor? I'm thinking about those embedded payment forms or iframes.
Right. Those are really common these days. We call this a shared management model. So you enter your credit card details, and it looks like it's all part of the retailer's website. But behind the scenes, that data is actually going directly to a third-party payment processor.
It's sneaky, but it's convenient.
It is. But even in these cases, the merchant still has PCI DSS responsibilities.
They do. Why is that?
Think about it. If their website were to be compromised, that could potentially allow those attackers to also mess with the embedded payment form or iframe.
Ah, so it's still connected.
Exactly. So the merchant is responsible for making sure their website is secure, not using default passwords, using strong encryption, protecting against malware, keeping their software updated, and using secure coding practices. And in this model, both the company that's hosting the iframe and the third-party payment processor are considered service providers.
So there's still a chain of responsibility.
There is. Now, what about the complete opposite end of the spectrum? What if a merchant fully outsources their whole e-commerce operation? Like everything's handled by a third party.
Hands-off approach.
Totally. And in this scenario, the merchant's PCI DSS burden can be a lot lighter. They might actually be eligible for something called SAQ-A, that's the Self-Assessment Questionnaire A. It's a simplified version of PCI DSS compliance with fewer requirements.
So they still have to do something.
Oh, yeah. The focus is primarily on making sure their connection to the third-party provider is secure.
Okay, so even if you're outsourcing everything, you still need to make sure your link to them is secure. And you've got to pick your partner wisely, make sure they're actually PCI DSS compliant.
Exactly. Due diligence is key.
Now, the PCI DSS guidelines, they also point to some common security vulnerabilities that online businesses need to watch out for. What are some of the big ones?
Well, one of the most common, and it's kind of surprising it's still around, is SQL injection.
SQL injection, what is that?
It's basically when attackers can slip malicious code into a website, often through poorly designed forms or input fields. And if they're successful, they can get unauthorized access to the databases, which could contain all sorts of sensitive info.
That sounds bad.
It can be. And the guidelines actually point out that SQL injection has been a known vulnerability for over a decade.
You'd think we'd have figured that out by now.
You would, but it's still a major problem. Then there's cross-site scripting, or XSS.
Another acronym.
I know, right? But it's important. This one's also about poor input validation, and it lets attackers inject malicious code that can then be executed in the browser of anyone who visits the page.
So they could steal login info, redirect people to bad websites, things like that.
Exactly. Then there's cross-site request forgery, or CSRF. These attacks trick your browser into sending unauthorized requests to a website.
So you might accidentally do something you didn't mean to do.
Yep, without even realizing it. And then there's buffer overflows. That's when an application tries to store more data than a temporary storage area can hold. And of course, weak authentication and poor session credential management are still big problems.
So basically, not having strong enough ways to verify who users are and keep their sessions secure.
Right.
And all these things can have huge consequences, not just for the businesses, but for us as consumers too.
Definitely.
Now, we talked a lot about those third-party service providers.
Mm-hmm.
What does PCI DSS have to say about those relationships?
The guidelines are very clear. The responsibilities of both the merchant and any third party have to be spelled out in black and white.
So in the contracts, service level agreements, all that.
Yeah. Everyone needs to know who's responsible for what. And merchants should be checking their service providers' attestations of compliance, or AOCs.
AOCs, what are those?
It's basically a document from the service provider saying, hey, we've been assessed, we're compliant with PCI DSS.
Okay, so it's proof they're taking security seriously.
Exactly. And here's a really practical tip from the guidelines. When you're outsourcing, figure out who's paying to fix security issues before you sign anything.
Smart. Avoid those nasty surprises down the road.
Exactly.
Now let's talk about PS Web, the company we mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
How does a company like them, a real-world e-commerce services provider, how do they fit into this whole PCI DSS world?
Well, PS Web, they describe themselves as providing post-click commerce solutions. So they're kind of working behind the scenes for a lot of different brands, handling stuff like order fulfillment, inventory management, customer support.
They touch a lot of data.
They do. And because they're dealing with customer data and payment information, PCI DSS compliance is absolutely essential for them.
It's not just a nice to have, it's part of their business model.
Exactly. In their annual report, they even highlight that they offer secure payment processing and fraud management services.
That's key for maintaining their client's brand reputation.
Absolutely. And they explicitly state that they're subject to PCI DSS. They even mention the potential risks of noncompliance.
Like what?
Well, they could face big fines, their banking relationships could be terminated, they might even face higher transaction fees.
So they have a big incentive to stay compliant.
A huge incentive. And they don't just stop there. They actually do security assessments on their own third-party service providers, including checking their PCI DSS compliance.
So it's a chain reaction, security all the way down.
Exactly, a web of trust and security.
Now, the PCI DSS guidelines, they also talk about the role of the end consumer, us, the people doing the online shopping. What do they recommend for us?
Well, they encourage merchants to educate their customers about safe online shopping practices.
Okay, like what?
Simple things like reading the merchant's privacy policies.
Yeah, those long, boring things no one ever reads.
I know, but they're important. And they advise against sending sensitive info like credit card details via email. That's just not secure.
Makes sense.
And, of course, using strong passwords and not saving them on shared computers.
Good reminders. Okay, last but not least, the guidelines actually give some good resources for those who want to learn more about information security and PCI DSS. What are some of those?
They mention the SANS Institute, which is a great resource for cybersecurity training and research.
I've heard them.
They're well respected. And of course, they highlight their own website, the PCI Security Standards Council website, for the official documentation and training materials.
Okay, straight from the source.
Yep. They also mention CERT-CC, the Computer Emergency Response Team Coordination Center, for up-to-date info on security vulnerabilities and coding standards.
Good to know.
And then for practical guidance, there's the Center for Internet Security, CIS. They offer hardening guides and benchmarks.
So how to actually secure your systems.
Right. And for broader IT governance and security practices, there's ISCA, the Information Systems Audit and Control Association.
So there's a lot out there for people who want to dive deeper.
There is. It's a whole world of information.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. It's clear that navigating e-commerce security and PCI DSS compliance, it's not simple.
It's definitely not. There's the data flow, securing all the different components, figuring out responsibilities with third parties, and staying ahead of all the vulnerabilities.
And it's interesting to see how companies like PS Web, whose main business isn't even cybersecurity, they still recognize how important PCI DSS is.
Absolutely. They get it. They know the risks if they don't take it seriously.
And this makes me think. Cyber threats are getting more sophisticated all the time, and we're only doing more and more online. So how will PCI DSS need to change in the future to keep up?
Yeah, that's a great question. How do you address emerging technologies, new attack methods? And what about continuous security monitoring? That's going to be huge.
Big questions for anyone involved in the online world, whether you're selling or buying. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative, and most importantly, we hope it gets you thinking about your own online security practices.
Stay safe out there.